I'm Greg Habing. I'm a professor at the College of Veterinary Medicine. Our group does a fair bit of work with dairy production systems and with biosecurity, and we thought this would be a great time to do a webinar focused on biosecurity. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty with the virus and how it's transmitted, and there's a lot of other questions. What's not changed are the basics of biosecurity. So our goal with this presentation is to give you all the tools or the resources to improve biosecurity on dairy farms for disease prevention. So one of the good things about biosecurity is it's not pathogen specific. So these measures that we'll talk about are broadly beneficial for disease prevention on dairy farms. And now with the influenza virus circulating amongst dairy farms, they've become just even more important. So our strategy for biosecurity is to first talk about influenza. So the characteristics of influenza and how it's spread really influences how we structured our biosecurity, our influences, our control strategies. So I'll give you just a really brief introduction to the flu virus and its epidemiology and important characteristics. Second, Alex Fonseca Martinez will talk about the basic definitions, concepts, and value of biosecurity for dairy farms. And then third, Dr. Gordon will talk about practical implementation of biosecurity on dairy farms. And then lastly, Dr. Ruda will talk about building a more comprehensive biosecurity plan and coming up with a strategy for that. Also, we're pleased to have Dr. Summers on the call. So he's the Chief of Division of Animal Health for the Ohio Department of Agriculture. So Dr. Summers, I'm particularly glad you're here so I can just refer all the sticky regulatory questions to you. So he'll, at the very end, he'll give us a bit of an update on the regulatory issues. And then lastly, Justin Kiefer, he's a clinical veterinarian for OSU as well. He's on the call and he can help us answer some of the questions since he's been very plugged into this outbreak in Ohio. All right, so for influenza, why do we care? So number one, it has caused pandemics in people. Fortunately, they don't happen very often, but influenza is constantly mutating and reassorting, and it's very unpredictable. That's the only predictable thing about flu virus is that it is unpredictable. So as it reassorts and mutates, often has different characteristics. And we care because monitoring and surveillance for the virus and the characteristics of the virus is important to identify the next pandemic. If you guys remember, in 2009, there was the H5N1 pandemic. It was a swine origin virus, and that spread pretty rapidly around the world. Fortunately, it was relatively mild disease. That virus never left us. It's the descendants of that virus are still causing seasonal outbreaks of flu in people. So it's people ask, where did that one go? Well, the answer is that it didn't go anywhere. It's still here. We also care about flu because it causes very severe impacts on poultry farms, as you probably already know. So it's almost inevitably fatal in poultry, even though it causes mild impacts in dairy cattle. It has a big impact on our poultry friends. So this is the data that I downloaded on April 17th. And I think this has not changed too much, but there were 12 confirmed flocks that are high-path avian influenza positive in the last 30 days that impacted a bit over 8 million birds. So we care a lot about the spread in dairy cattle because it appears that it might be spreading to the poultry flocks as well. And then lastly, and more selfishly, we care because the impacts on dairy farms are still important, right? It's causing economic impacts and drops in milk production and sick cows. And these are not really yet well quantified. We hear a lot about mild and moderate illnesses, but in some farms, that might not be the case. It might be more severe and have very important economic and welfare impacts on the dairy cow. So influenza, like I said, it's very unpredictable. For all the species shown here, cats, dogs, horses, chickens, pigs, there's different flavors of the virus that are circulating out there. So there's different subtypes that are out there. We've had the privilege of influenza not being a major issue in dairy cattle for quite a long time. But unfortunately, that's no longer the case. And also, as I'd mentioned, as it mutates and reassorts, it requires requires different capabilities, and now it's acquired the capability to infect dairy cattle. So folks have asked, is this unusual? And yes, it is for dairy cattle, but it's not that unusual for it to jump to a different species. So for instance, there was a really broad outbreak of the flu virus across elephant seals that caused a lot of elephant seal deaths, and that was one of the first times it was recognized in seals. So moving into a different species isn't entirely surprising for the flu virus, although it is surprising for dairy cattle just because it hasn't happened up until now, or at least to not to this extent. Some basic terminology that I get out of the way. So there's four basic types of influenza: influenza A, B, C, and D. So the one that we're discussing today is influenza A. So this typing system is important to distinguish different strains with different species preferences and different epidemiology. So the differentiation of strains is important to understand the virus, and it starts more broadly with typing it out. So influenza D has been recovered from dairy cattle, but this is the first time that there's been a widespread outbreak of influenza A in dairy cattle. And so getting more specifically, we can differentiate within types of influenza by identifying the subtype. And this is identified by characterizing the proteins on the surface of the virus. And so you'll see the term H5N1, so the hemagglutinin, and then the neuraminidase, that's the H and the N is what they stand for. And so the numbers just designate a different type of protein. And so this particular strain that we're worried about is H5N1, and there's lots of different other subtypes that affect different species. And then there's a lot of diversity within subtypes, so it's still important to differentiate within those subtypes, and we can do that through genome sequencing. And so you'll see the terms clades and subclades to denote specific strains within that subtype. And so the strain that we're worried about right now is clade 2.3.4.4b. Just rolls right off the tongue, makes it nice and easy. Some more terminology. So highly pathogenic avian influenza, that's been discussed a lot. So this refers to the potential of the virus to kill chickens, right? So the highly pathogenicity, its ability to cause disease. And in this case, we've always used the term highly pathogenic to refer to the potential of the virus to kill chickens. And even though we're talking about an outbreak in dairy cattle, that naming has still continued, even though it's infecting a different species. So this is a highly pathogenic avian influenza strain, H5N1. There are low pathogenic avian influenza strains that don't cause any disease or very mild signs of disease in chickens, and so we're much less interested in those. So a bit more about transmission in poultry, some of the kind of basic things that we know. So the natural reservoir, the place where the virus likes to live, it hangs out, is maintained, is waterfowl, migrating waterfowl. So that's problematic because we often have waterfowl migrating over our farms and defecating in stacks of feed. So that's an inherent limitation challenge with biosecurity. So transmission between poultry, once the virus is introduced onto the farm, then it can spread very quickly between chickens. So it's spread through direct contact. So infected chickens will shed it in their feces, and they can become infected through ingestion or inhalation. So suffice to say, once it's onto the farm, especially on a poultry farm, it's going to spread very quickly. And then transmission between farms. This is kind of the big focus for today, is how do we control or mitigate that spread between farms. So that could happen because of migratory waterfowl. So in other words, the same waterfowl are moving and defecating across different farms. It could happen because there's direct animal movements between farms, as we've seen with some of the infected dairy farms, or it could happen more indirectly. In other words, there's people or workers that are contaminated with a virus that move from an infected farm to a non-infected farm, and then thereby introduce that virus onto the farm. So again, this part will be the big focus for the webinar today. So more specifically in dairy cattle, just to give a bit of a background, it's not going to be comprehensive, and it might be information that you've already seen. So number one, if you're on a farm, you need to be able to recognize the signs. So the signs are relatively non-specific. So they stop eating as much. there's decreased ruminations. Characteristically, there's abnormal milk, so it's thick and off-colored, and there's typically a significant milk drought. So you might look for these signs happening in an unusual number of cows over a particular period of time. So you're probably used to seeing these signs occasionally, but if you get a bunch of cows at the same time that are affected with that sort of thing, then the alarm bells might go off and you might start talking to your vet to figure out what's going on. So transmission between cows. So like I said, influenza, it behaves differently when it's infecting different species. And so we know some things for transmission between cows. We know that it is transmitted between cows. That was a question in the beginning was, are they just getting it all from waterfowl? But no, it definitely appears that there is, in fact, cow-to-cow transmission. There are very high viral concentrations in the milk from clinically affected cows. So certainly the virus in this case has a propensity to go to the udder and infect the gland. For other sample types, for nasal swabs or for fecal samples or for urine samples, the positivity has been a bit inconsistent. But what's more consistent is that the milk is affected and contains high viral loads. Shedding without signs or asymptomatic shedding. So I made this slide a little bit ago. I think we're getting more comfortable that to some extent there is some asymptomatic shedding. We just we don't have a good idea to what extent cows that are not showing signs of being infected can transmit the virus. There's still a lot unknown as far as the asymptomatic shedding and the contagiousness of those cows without signs. And then transmission between farms, just like poultry farms, it's going to be migratory waterfowl. That's how the dairy farms were initially infected, was through migratory waterfowl. We also know that some of the farms became infected, some of the dairy farms became infected because of cow movement. So cows moving from one infected farm to a non-infected farm. So that's definitely part of how it's happening. And then the indirect transmission, in other words, contaminated people or equipment or other vehicles, that's a bit unknown still. What's really interesting about this particular virus is that it can be transmitted from dairy cows to other species. So, for instance, cats from affected farms have been confirmed with H5N1, the same virus that was infecting the cows. So on many of the affected farms, they've noted the illness or deaths in cats. So cats are very capable of getting this virus. And then I think we're getting more comfortable with the idea that it's going from dairy farms back to poultry farms. So this is certainly an area of active investigation, but it looks as though there's transmission from dairy farms back to poultry farms. And we do know that the genome sequence is very similar between poultry and dairy farms, the farms that are infected. And there's some kind of epidemiologic links between the dairy and the poultry farms. So that's really concerning because, as I mentioned, it has very severe impacts on the poultry industry. And then speaking of transmission to other species, so we've documented transmission from cows to people. And fortunately, it's been mild so far, but it's been confirmed in more than one instance. And so far, it's been relatively mild cases of conjunctivitis. We don't expect transmission between people. So far, it's appeared to have been transmission from cows or from animals. And based on the genome sequence, we don't expect this, and it's not yet been documented. Nonetheless, I'll have some resources to show in a little bit. So enhanced personal protective equipment for the workers is warranted, especially for the milkers, since there's high concentrations of the virus in the milk. So consider face shields, goggles, consider N95 masks, even though that's really difficult to do in a hot environment. But again, I'll have a link for more resources on enhancing that PPE. So limiting the human infections is obviously helpful, important for the workers. It's also a part of biosecurity because if we have infected people that are working on an infected farm and then moving to another farm, then that just enhances their ability to transmit the virus. So it's important for the health of the workers, but it's also an important component for biosecurity. A bunch of different links for resources. So some frequently asked questions, some biosecurity fact sheets, and biosecurity recommendations. And then the more comprehensive information for protecting workers from the strain of the virus is available at this